Welcome to this in-depth exploration of one of the most horrifying serial killers in American history, Dean Corll, also known as the Candy Man. Over the next 3 hours, we'll delve into the life and crimes of a man who terrorized the Houston area in the early 1970s, orchestrating the abduction, torture, and murder of at least 28 young boys. This is the story of a seemingly ordinary man who harbored unimaginable darkness, a story of manipulation, brutality, and the devastation left in the wake of his crimes. Early life and background. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His parents, Mary Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll, had a tumultuous marriage characterized by frequent arguments and separations. Dean was the first of 2 sons, and his early life was marked by instability. His parents divorced when he was young, and his mother took custody of Dean and his younger brother, Stanley. Dean's mother was a strict and overprotective figure, while his father was distant and often harsh. The family moved frequently between Indiana and Texas as Mary tried to establish a stable home for her sons. Eventually, Mary settled in Houston, Texas, where she started a small candy business, the Corll Candy Company. Dean was heavily involved in the family business from a young age, and he became known in the neighborhood as the Candy Man for handing out free candy to local children. Despite the instability at home, Dean was described as a quiet, polite, and well-behaved child. He was academically average and did not stand out much in school, though he did play in the school band. However, there were early signs of psychological issues. Dean was reportedly shy, introverted, and had difficulty forming close relationships, particularly with his peers. He also had a close but peculiar relationship with his mother, who remained a dominant figure in his life. After graduating from high school in 1958, Corll briefly attended a local community college before being drafted into the U.S. Army in 1964. He served as a radio repairman and was stationed in Fort Hood, Texas. However, his time in the Army was short-lived, as he was honorably discharged in 1965 after requesting a release to help his mother with the family business. Upon his return to Houston, Corll resumed his role at the Candy Company, where he would eventually meet the young boys who would become his victims. The Candy Company and the birth of a predator. The Corll Candy Company was a small but successful business, and Dean Corll was an integral part of its operations. He was responsible for producing the candy and managing the factory, while his mother handled sales and administration. The factory was located in Houston Heights, a working-class neighborhood that was home to many families and children. Corll's involvement in the candy business allowed him to interact with the local youth, many of whom would stop by the factory for free candy. He became well-known and liked among the neighborhood children, who nicknamed him the Candy Man and Pied Piper. However, behind this friendly facade, Corll was harboring dark and violent fantasies. It was around this time that Corll began to exhibit increasingly concerning behavior. He developed an interest in young boys, and his interactions with them became more predatory. He would often invite them to his apartment, offering them alcohol, drugs, or a place to stay. It was here that Corll began to groom his victims, exploiting their vulnerabilities and building trust before subjecting them to unspeakable horrors. The accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Dean Corll did not act alone in his crimes. He manipulated and recruited 2 teenage boys, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, to assist him in luring and abducting his victims. These 2 boys, both from troubled backgrounds, became essential to Corll's operation and were complicit in many of the murders. David Owen Brooks was the first to be drawn into Corll's web. Brooks was a teenager when he met Corll, and the 2 developed a close, albeit highly inappropriate, relationship. Corll began to groom Brooks by offering him money and gifts in exchange for sexual favors. Over time, Corll introduced Brooks to his darker activities, eventually involving him in the abduction and murder of other boys. Brooks, who was emotionally dependent on Corll and financially reliant on the money he provided, became a willing participant in the crimes. Elmer Wayne Henley was the second accomplice Corll recruited. Henley, like Brooks, came from a difficult home life and was looking for a way to make money. Corll initially lured Henley into his orbit by offering him money to bring other boys to his apartment under the guise of partying. However, Henley's involvement quickly escalated from luring victims to actively participating in their murders. Unlike Brooks, Henley later claimed that he was unaware of Corll's intentions when he first began bringing boys to Corll's home, but he eventually became deeply involved in the crimes. Together, Brooks and Henley helped Corll abduct numerous boys from the Houston Heights area. They would lure the victims to Corll's apartment with promises of a party, money, or drugs. Once there, the boys were restrained, often with handcuffs or rope, and subjected to unimaginable torture before being murdered. Corll's method of killing varied, but most victims were either strangled or shot. Their bodies were then buried in remote locations, including a boat shed Corll rented and various beaches along the Texas coast. The horrific crimes. Dean Corll's killing spree began in earnest around 1970 and continued until his death in 1973. Over this period, he, along with Brooks and Henley, abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 28 boys, though the true number of victims may be higher. The details of Corll's crimes are among the most disturbing in the annals of American criminal history. Corll's victims were all young boys, mostly between the ages of 13 and 20, and many were runaways or from troubled homes. They were often acquaintances or friends of Brooks and Henley, which made it easier for the accomplices to lure them into Corll's trap. Once in Corll's apartment, the boys were subjected to unimaginable horrors. The torture. Corll had a specific and sadistic method for torturing his victims. He kept a wooden torture board in his apartment, to which he would tie the boys by their hands and feet. The board was equipped with holes to allow for easy binding, ensuring the boys were immobilized. Corll would then proceed to sexually assault and torture them, sometimes for hours or even days. He used various tools, including pliers, knives, and whips, to inflict pain and suffering on his victims. The torture often included beatings, electrical shocks, and sexual assault. The murders. After Corll had finished torturing his victims, he would kill them, usually by strangulation or gunshot. Corll was known to kill his victims in a variety of ways, often depending on his mood or the amount of time he had available. Some victims were shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, while others were strangled with a rope or cord. Corll took pleasure in the act of killing, and his methods grew more brutal as time went on. Disposal of the bodies. Once the boys were dead, Corll, with the help of Brooks and Henley, would dispose of their bodies in remote locations. The primary burial site was a rented boat shed in southwest Houston, where the bodies were buried in shallow graves. Other bodies were buried on beaches along the Texas coast, while a few were dumped in wooded areas. The boys' bodies were often wrapped in plastic sheeting or placed in wooden boxes before being buried. The aftermath. The discovery of Dean Corll's crimes shocked the nation. The gruesome details of the murders, the involvement of young accomplices, and the sheer number of victims made this one of the most horrifying serial killer cases in American history. Corll's death meant that he would never face justice for his crimes, but the full extent of his atrocities came to light during the investigations and trials that followed. Investigations. In the immediate aftermath of Corll's death, the Houston Police Department launched an extensive investigation to uncover the full scope of the crimes. Elmer Wayne Henley, who had shot and killed Corll, led authorities to the various burial sites where the bodies of the victims were hidden. The primary site, a rented boat shed in southwest Houston, contained the remains of 17 victims. Additional bodies were discovered in other locations, including beaches along the Texas coast and a wooded area near Lake Sam Rayburn. As the bodies were unearthed, the public and the media were horrified by the sheer brutality of the murders. Many of the victims had been reported missing for months or even years, and their families were left to grapple with the devastating reality of what had happened to their loved ones. The community of Houston Heights, where many of the victims had lived, was particularly traumatized by the revelations, as Corll had been a familiar figure in the neighborhood. Brooks and Henley's arrest. Following the discovery of the bodies, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley were both arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The trials of Brooks and Henley were highly publicized, as the full extent of Corll's crimes and the involvement of his accomplices were revealed. During his trial, Henley claimed that he had initially been unaware of Corll's intentions and that he had only become involved out of fear for his own life. However, the evidence presented in court, including Henley's own admissions and the testimony of witnesses, made it clear that he had been an active participant in the abductions, torture, and murders of the victims. Henley was ultimately convicted of 6 murders and was sentenced to life in prison. David Brooks, who had been less directly involved in the actual murders but had played a significant role in luring the victims to Corll, also faced trial. Brooks showed little remorse during the proceedings, and the jury found him guilty of participating in the murders of the boys. He was sentenced to life in prison as well. Legacy of fear and trauma. The case of Dean Corll, the Candy Man, left a lasting scar on the Houston community and on the families of the victims. The brutality of the crimes, combined with the fact that the victims were so young, created a pervasive sense of fear and mistrust in the community. Parents became more protective of their children, and the case served as a grim reminder of the dangers that can lurk in seemingly safe environments. For the families of the victims, the pain of losing their loved ones in such a horrific manner was compounded by the knowledge that Corll had manipulated and coerced other young boys into becoming his accomplices. Many of the families struggled with feelings of anger and betrayal, knowing that some of the victims had been lured to their deaths by people they knew and trusted. Cultural impact. The case of Dean Corll has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and true crime shows, cementing his place in the annals of American criminal history. The term Houston mass murders has become synonymous with Corll's reign of terror, and his crimes continue to be studied by criminologists and psychologists seeking to understand the mind of a serial killer. The case also highlighted the vulnerabilities of at-risk youth and the ways in which predators can exploit those vulnerabilities for their own gain. Corll's ability to manipulate both his victims and his accomplices serves as a chilling example of the dangers posed by individuals who prey on the weak and the vulnerable. Final thoughts. Dean Corll's crimes remain some of the most heinous in American history. His ability to conceal his dark side behind the facade of a friendly, candy-giving man in the community is a stark reminder that evil can often hide in plain sight. The lives he took, the pain he caused, and the legacy of fear he left behind continue to haunt the memories of those who lived through the horror of his crimes. As we reflect on this dark chapter in history, it's important to remember the victims and the families who were forever changed by Corll's actions. While justice may have been served with Corll's death and the imprisonment of his accomplices, the impact of his crimes will never be forgotten.